He cast her out as an employee and brought her back as the woman who could save his empire. Emma Callahan began, the night soaked, barefoot, and humiliated by the most powerful man she had ever known. But by the time dawn broke, she had survived a murder attempt, exposed a financial betrayal, forced Nicholas Carver to apologize, and stepped into a world of hidden command rooms, silent justice, and dangerous trust. She thought he had thrown her away. In truth, he had just pulled her into the center of his war. Let us examine the pathology of this encounter, shall we? You and I will dissect this scene just as I would a maximum security case file. We observe the subject, Emma, exhibiting an acute stress response. She is paralyzed, her nervous system flooding with cortisol as she grips those meticulously audited reports. Across the room, Nicholas Carver presents textbook signs of malignant narcissism. He gazes at the storm, completely devoid of effective empathy, and coldly orders her out into the freezing deluge. Notice how he weaponizes his lack of reaction to establish absolute dominance over her reality. When a predator forces you into the bitter cold, it mimics psychological execution. Yet, remember this clinical truth. Sometimes absolute detachment from a sociopathic abuser is your only path to true salvation. The environmental conditions are entirely hostile. It is 11 at night, pouring rain, and MS transportation options are neutralized. She attempts a rational appeal, citing the dead trains, but Nicholas employs classic Darvo manipulation, deny, attack, reverse victim and offender. He invalidates her flawless data, projecting his own institutional corruption onto her exhaustive labor. The severe sleep deprivation in her eyes points to a traumatized employee, desperate for a powerful figure's validation. But clinically speaking, she simply unearthed a reality he desperately needed to keep buried. This is gaslighting in its purest form. When you uncover an abuser's hidden transgressions, they will systematically attempt to dismantle your sanity to protect their own malignant pathology. Those trembling documents represent a severe psychological trigger. Emma did not merely locate an anomaly. She documented systemic financial laundering, the cognitive dissonance she experienced watching those syndicate enforcers in the lobby is fascinating. She observed the criminal pathology of her employer, yet rationalized her complicity due to severe familial stressors. Her mother's crushing medical debt served as the psychological chain binding her to this predatory environment. You and I must recognize the behavioral trap she fell into here. Financial compensation can act as a powerful anesthetic, numbing a person to the immediate danger of their surroundings. But compromising your internal moral compass for sake of basic economic survival will inevitably fracture the very psyche you are desperately attempting to protect. Emma attempts a final negotiation, her vocal tremors indicating advanced emotional distress. The megalomaniac narcissist responds with sudden, disproportionate aggression. Nicholas threatens physical removal, his eyes entirely devoid of the micro-expressions that signify human empathy. That flat, dead stare triggers her amygdala's fight or flight response. The looming security detail solidifies her absolute powerlessness. She experiences intense, corrosive shame. Though her primal impulse is to hurl the documents at his chest, her base survival instinct overrides the anger, forcing her to comply. In behavioral analysis, we understand that true resilience is not always found in aggressive confrontation. Often, it is the calculate decision to retreat and quietly endure, simply so the psyche might survive the immediate threat. The auditory feedback of her footsteps serves as metronome for her psychological collapse. The isolated elevator descent mirrors a depressive spiral, lowering her from the seat of corporate power into the reality of her subjugation. Observing her fractured reflection in the steel doors induces a moment of severe dissociation. She is unraveling, suppressing the physiological release of tears to maintain a fragile illusion of control. The indifferent night guard perfectly illustrates the bystander effect inherent in corrupt institutions. She crosses the threshold into the freezing storm, the icy rain immediately compromising her her core temperature. Yet, from a clinical perspective, extreme environmental shocks can be highly therapeutic. A brutal disruption to your reality is often the exact mechanism required to purge the toxic attachments you could not sever yourself. Observe her rapid physical deterioration. The subject is drenched, her dissolving makeup serving as a visual indicator of collapsing emotional defenses. She exhibits an irrational attachment to the folder, clutching it as a transitional object, even as the ink bleeds into useless streaks. The destruction of this empirical evidence creates a profound sense of ego death. The proof of her reality is literally washing down the storm drain. She pushes forward despite severe muscle tremors and the hostile auditory stimulus of the thunder. In her current cognitive framework, she categorizes this trauma as an absolute rock bottom. But psychiatric recovery often begins at this precise threshold. It is only when the mind is entirely shattered by external hostility that the human psyche can systematically restructure itself into something completely unbreakable. Stick with me here, because we are about to witness the true psychological toll of her subjugation. Emma navigates the unforgiving environment in a dissociative fugue state, moving mechanically under the harsh street lamps. Her compromised footwear mirrors the heavy cognitive burden of her employer's betrayal. The icy rain bombards her sensory receptors, inducing localized numbness and forcing her nervous system into extreme depletion. Yet, pay close clinical attention to her micro-movements. Her clenched fists indicate a deeply ingrained defiance. This is the biological manifestation of pure resilience. The physical body continues to operate, even when the conscious mind begs for collapse. The fundamental cognitive breakthrough a trauma victim desperately needs is almost always located exactly on the other side of their maximum threshold for suffering. Her internal focus shifts to a primary attachment figure, her institutionalized mother. This is a common cognitive regression when the ego is under severe threat. Her mother represents unconditional positive regard, the singular psychological anchor preventing total collapse. Emma is processing the perceived failure of her intense sacrifices, the sold vehicle, the caloric deficits, the substandard housing. She operated under the false assumption of a meritocracy, believing absolute compliance would guarantee safety. The realization that sociopaths actively punish competence triggers a paradoxical reaction, a bitter, fractured laugh. As the violent wind forces her against a rusted lamppost, we observe a critical truth. When malignant forces attempt to dismantle your reality, genuine interpersonal bonds remain the only valid stabilizers in the ensuing psychological chaos. We observe tissue damage to her lower extremities. The ruined footwear, once a symbol of her corporate assimilation, is now inflicting active trauma. Her decision to remove the shoes is a radical assertion of agency. Walking barefoot across the freezing asphalt is agonizing, yet it reclaims a microscopic locus of control over her environment. The waterlogged financial documents have lost all empirical value. Driven by a sudden spike in adrenaline, she forcefully deposits the folder into a waste receptacle. This is a necessary behavioral purge. She is actively discarding the physical manifestation of her trauma. 3 weeks of severe sleep deprivation, wasted on a corrupt hierarchy. It is a vital step in the healing process. You must physically abandon the artifact of your victimization to create the required cognitive space for your eventual psychological rehabilitation. You and I have seen this moment in countless case files. Stripped of her social standing, Emma engages in a sensory grounding technique, letting the freezing precipitation shock her nervous system. She experiences a fleeting moment of passive, suicidal ideation, a clinical desire for ego dissolution. She hypothesizes her absence would mean nothing to the narcissist who just erased her identity. However, her core personality structure remains highly resilient. Activating her sympathetic nervous system, she tightens her jaw and continues her physical march toward isolation. She suffers from a severe predictive error, assuming the trauma has concluded for the night. In the study of human behavior, massive, life-altering pivot points consistently materialize precisely when the subject mistakenly assumes the variables of their suffering are finally fixed. The subject alters her trajectory into an unmonitored alleyway. The erratic frequency of the failing street lamps visually fragments her movement, amplifying her psychological isolation. The escalating environmental noise serves to further dysregulate her auditory processing. She exhibits self-soothing behaviors, compressing her torso to conserve body heat, while peripheral neuropathy makes her bare feet feel as though she is walking on shattered glass. Her situational awareness is critically impaired by extreme exhaustion. The ambient storm noise completely masks the acoustic signature of an approaching vehicle, its headlights penetrating the darkness far too late. Even when the nervous system demands a shutdown, absolute vigilance is mandatory. Malignant threats consistently target the behavioral blind spots that are left unguarded during moments of severe emotional trauma. Emma's threat detection systems are entirely offline. Her cognitive depletion is so severe that her singular focus is returning to a secure location. As she breaches the intersection, a catastrophic event occurs. A massive black sedan rapidly approaches, the violent friction of its tires breaking the auditory baseline of the storm. The sudden high-intensity light triggers her optic nerve, plunging her directly into a state of tonic immobility. The sheer terror paralyzes her motor functions. Her frantic attempt to retreat results in a loss of traction, causing her to crash hard against the wet asphalt. She cognitively accepts her impending termination. Yet, at the exact precipice of disaster, an external variable intervenes. A firm grip on her arm stops her fall. You and I must remember that salvation frequently manifests precisely when total annihilation appears mathematically certain. You and I have seen enough victims to recognize when a human mind fractures. Freezing rain falls as Emma is violently propelled to the pavement. She hits the concrete hard, entering immediate shock beside the male subject, who just shoved her from a speeding vehicle's path. Metal crumples against a parked truck. Glass falls while alarms pierce the night. Gasping for air, her auditory processing compromised by trauma, she visually tracks upward. The subject leans in close, shielding her from the storm, issuing a strict command to stay down. Blinking through the downpour, she attempts to map his dark features. In clinical observation, we learn a vital truth. When your reality undergoes catastrophic failure, the hand pulling you from the wreckage is rarely someone you trust. Let us clinically examine the stimuli. Freezing rain lashes the concrete, and looming over Emma is an imposing male figure. A jagged scar catches the dim illumination. The pain of physical trauma is immediately overridden by cognitive recognition. She identifies him a covert enforcer, operating for Carver International. Before she can vocalize her panic, he is transmitting on a tactical radio, confirming the asset is secure. He turns, delivering a psychological blow that induces severe vasoconstriction. The driver fled, he states coldly. This was a calculated assassination attempt. She was the primary target. It underscores a grim behavioral reality. The predators we actively ignore in our daily periphery are sometimes the exact instruments standing between us and a violent end. The enforcer displays zero empathetic effect. His focus locks onto the fleeing sedan, rapidly logging vehicular data. Terminating his radio, he directs his clinical intensity toward Emma, assessing her mobility. Acute panic triggers an adrenaline dump. She vocalizes distress, demanding his motives. David exhibits no baseline shift. He flatly admits he operates under the authority of Nicholas Carver, a classic megalomaniac narcissist. Extending a scarred hand, he issues a strict directive. They must break line of sight immediately, as hostile actors intend to terminate her. This highlights a critical principle of behavioral consequence. Exposing buried pathology inevitably draws out predators, but sometimes you must rely on another monster to navigate the dark. Emma is submerged in severe cognitive dissonance. A hostile actor just attempted lethal force, only for her to be intercepted by a phantom variable. The most agonizing data point. This asset reports to Nicholas Carver, the narcissistic architect, who systematically dismantled her professional life 60 minutes prior. David hauls her upright, applying rigid mechanical force, anticipating her motor function failure. Her psyche fractures under conflicting stimuli of perceived betrayal and sudden salvation. It forces a cognitive realignment. Human behavioral patterns rarely match their external projections. In extreme survival scenarios, the individual you have, profiled as your primary antagonist, often becomes the sole physical barrier keeping you breathing. Analyze the physical toll on the subject. Abrasions compromise her patellas. An acute thermoregulatory failure causes violent tremors, demonstrating utility over empathy. David removes his canvas jacket, draping it over her shock-addled frame to preserve core temperature. He manually directs her into an unlit alley containing an idling, nondescript gray sedan. This vehicle lacks corporate identifiers. It is an untraceable asset engineered for evasion. He deposits her inside, taking the operator seat and maintaining blackout conditions as they merge with erratic traffic. Survival dictates a radical reduction of ego. When pursued by an apex predator, the logical response is not confrontation, but the complete abandonment of social identity to successfully assimilate into the shadows. The compromised heating unit dispenses minimal thermal relief while Emma struggles to process the trauma. She verbalizes her denial, whispering to question if the vehicular assault was intentional. David maintains a predatory gaze on the rearview mirrors, scanning for surveillance anomalies. His vocal modulation remains chillingly static. He categorizes the event as a contracted assassination, noting this low-profile transport ensures their invisibility while the perpetrators assume she is seeking medical aid. Emma's posture collapses. The trigger variable was the misappropriated financial ledger she exposed. The clinical takeaway is brutal. Piercing a system of deception requires psychological fortitude, as disrupting a criminal ecology instantly designates you as the primary target. The fragments of this targeted operation are aligning. David observes her traumatized reflection. He clinically details that uncovering the illicit financial diversion classified her as a threat to an internal corporate parasite. The executive hierarchy detected the hemorrhage but lacked a profile of the mole. Experiencing emotional exhaustion, Emma rests against the glass to pose a defining query. If the megalomaniac Carver recognized her vulnerability, why initiate her public professional destruction? David negates her assumption. It was a calculated psychological diversion to lull the actual predator into complacency. It reinforces a harsh paradigm. In the mechanics of survival, absolute protective measures often camouflage themselves as devastating acts of abandonment. You and I are going to unpack this manipulation together. Observe the extreme lengths of Carver's control. David reveals the narcissist never permitted her to exit into that storm unmonitored. Emma experiences his acute tension, realizing this enforcer maintains surveillance from the moment she left the building. David logs that 3 additional operatives were actively mapping her trajectory. She was enveloped in a high-security containment grid. Yet, his vocal pitch lowers to a grave frequency. The hostile entity initiated their strike with statistically improbable speed. This illustrates a complex behavioral dichotomy regarding trust. Even when cognitive bias convinces you of total isolation, unseen mechanisms are often operating in the periphery, shielding you from predators. Emma registers hyperventilation, her respiratory function suppressed by the threat matrix. Attempting to reestablish spatial awareness, she demands their destination. David flatly notes they are routing to Carver's isolated compound. It is a fortified environment, saturated with armed personnel and medical staff. Suffering from adrenal depletion, she irrationally requests transport to her primary residence, seeking a known baseline. David dismantles this psychological crutch with operational logic. A primary residence is the mathematically obvious kill zone for any professional. Her motor functions halt. It validates a critical tenet of threat assessment. During an active crisis, the environment that offers the highest psychological comfort is statistically the most lethal location to occupy. The evasion vehicle navigates a secluded road, decelerating as a reinforced iron gate breaches the heavy precipitation. A sprawling, moisture-dense estate asserts itself against the environmental chaos, emitting warm light from towering windows. It provides a stark psychological contrast to the urban hostility they evaded. Terminating the ignition, David classifies this structure as the singular remaining secure zone, disembarking onto the saturated gravel, exhibiting severe tremors from adrenaline drop and thermal loss. Emma processes her assimilation into an unfamiliar threat ecosystem. It demonstrates a recurring clinical observation. Pushing a subject to the boundary of mental endurance is frequently the necessary catalyst to forge unprecedented psychological resilience. Before the enforcer initiates contact with the entry, the doors breach violently, subjecting Emma to a sudden influx of thermal radiation. The true autonomic disruption occurs when she visually identifies the subject in the foyer Nicholas Carver. The profiled untouchable narcissist exhibits massive psychological decompensation. He stands in saturated clothing, his presentation erratic, suggesting extreme emotional distress. His pupil dilation betrays an acute limbic panic wholly uncharacteristic of his baseline. He eliminates the physical distance with rapid, uncalculated momentum. This illustrates a core psychiatric truth. Beneath meticulously constructed sociopathic armor, a subject often harbors profound, irrational attachments that defy all logic. Stick with me, because this is the juncture where manipulative dependency mimics genuine affection. Emma remains in a dissociative state, paralyzed by trauma. Carver halts in her personal space. He conducts a frantic visual assessment of her injuries, his gaze exhibiting an obsessive hunger. When he vocalizes his inquiry, his tone is a fractured whisper, a complete deviation from his authoritarian profile. Processing this fear from a known tyrant destabilizes her reality. She manages an involuntary nod. Carver exhibits fine motor tremors before placing his hand on her shoulder, establishing the anchor of Stockholm Syndrome. We observe something profound here. Dominant personalities are often driven by an ingrained terror of losing their objects of control. Let us open this clinical file by observing the aftermath of the trauma. The housekeeper rushes in with heavy towels, interrupting the psychological crime scene. Carver instantly reverts to the megalomaniacal narcissist profile, barking commands to stabilize his victim. Yet his impenetrable armor deliberately fractures. He turns to Emma, projecting chilling regret and offering a calculated apology. Emma remains paralyzed. A jagged laugh rips from her bruised throat. She shivers, consumed by the rage of a traumatized captive. He coldly confesses to breaking her psychological foundation to ensure her survival. In my clinical experience, we recognize this bitter truth. Violent psychological manipulations leave permanent neurological scars, and trusting a predator is a lethal mistake. Let you and I examine this specific behavioral frame together, because the narcissist's illusion is shattering. Nicholas stands before her, his jaw locked tight, forcing out his brutal justification. He claims he had to make the rival syndicate believe she was psychologically broken just to draw the assassins into the light. Emma resists the programming. Her fingernails bite deep into her palms as she whispers that he simply wanted her hollowed out. Nicholas steps into her personal space, his voice dropping to an agonizing gravel, swearing he only crushed her spirit to keep her breathing. This introduces a terrifying psychiatric paradox we often see in captivity cases. Grabbed his shirt. The exact hands that violently drag you away from the edge of the cliff are precisely the ones that leave the darkest bruises on your mind. The untouchable architect of this criminal empire is showing severe cognitive dissonance. The clinical frost that locks his features melts into raw, suffocating panic. For Emma, witnessing this megalomaniac look genuinely terrified triggers a deeper trauma response than the physical crash ever did. Her voice shakes, demanding to know why her life matters when she is merely a disposable asset on his ledger. Nicholas shuts his eyes, fighting a violent internal war against his own suppressed empathy. He insists she was never just a passing face, but the vulnerability terrifies him. He snaps his psychopathic walls back into place instantly, ordering the housekeeper to remove her. The clinical lesson here is undeniable. Unprocessed emotion can pierce the heaviest mental armor when a predator suddenly says he realizes the true value of their prey. Emma trails the housekeeper in dead silence, her nervous system shutting down from the violent emotional whiplash. The dimly lit halls mirror the dark recesses of her captor's mind. One truth rings clear in her shifting reality. Nicholas is a twisted psychological labyrinth, and his volatile fixation on her is a fatal danger. Later, she sits numbly in a mahogany room, a heavy blanket draped over her trembling shoulders. The private physician leaves behind small white sedatives, but her true agony is untouchable by chemical restraints. This pulls back the curtain on a bitter clinical reality I see in my patients. Superficial physical lacerations heal quickly, but the deep neurological trauma of being used as a helpless pawn will systematically rewire a victim's brain for decades. The door shuts, leaving Emma in an isolated quiet. Outside, rain falls in gray sheets, mimicking the chaotic storm inside her mind. I want you and I to step back and clinically trace this pathology to its origin. She stares into the fire, regressing to the moment she found the financial discrepancy. It manifested as a phantom number buried within a criminal ledger. When she pulled that thread, a terrifying behavioral pattern emerged. Tiny fractures in the accounts were bleeding out illicit wealth. Believing she possessed high moral clarity, she handed that explosive report directly to the kingpin. The psychological lesson here is severe. Dragging a hidden pathology into the light might make you feel like a righteous savior. But, in the criminal underworld, it simply paints a glowing target on your own back. The cognitive realizations strikes her chest like a physical blow. That financial report is exactly why she was thrown to the wolves. She was never the brilliant pioneer who discovered the missing capital, and the kingpin was never a negligent fool. The narcissist already knew. He was hunting his internal demons when she naively wandered into his war zone. The door clicks, and the megalomaniac steps back into the room, carrying the suffocating gravity of an executioner. He sinks into the leather armchair, his clinical gaze terrifyingly calm, and asks if she has finally processed his manipulation. Emma turns to ice. This is a sobering psychiatric reminder. Never assume you hold the complete behavioral picture. An apex predator is always quietly playing a much darker game behind the curtain. Emma observes him for a long minute before offering a defeated, conditioned nod. Her voice is a fragile whisper when she states that those transfers were no accident. It was a calculated, bloodless psychological robbery. Nicholas leans back into the shadows, masking his sociopathic nature. He confesses he has been hunting these ghosts for 3 agonizing months. The architect of the theft is a phantom, keeping every stolen drop beneath the behavioral detection threshold. Emma leans forward, subconsciously pulled into the inescapable gravity of her captor. This interaction reveals a powerful law of psychological survival. True, calculated patience is the deadliest weapon. Sometimes you must sit quietly in the dark, letting a parasite believe they have won, only to track them back to the source. Emma demands an identity for the phantom pulling the strings. Nicholas stares back, perfectly detached from her volatility. He admits his suspect list was reduced to 3 faces, but he needed an outsider to uncover the fraud. Let you and I pause here, because this is where the trauma bond truly warps. Cortisol floods her system as Emma realizes she was the sacrificial lamb. Nicholas never flinches. He coldly confesses he fed her those files, banking on her analytical mind to trip the wire. She wants to tear the room apart, but her chest feels hollowed out. She condemns him for letting her wander blindfolded into a slaughterhouse. It is a harsh, clinical tragedy. The towering intellect you pride yourself on is often exactly what makes you the perfect, predictable pawn for a narcissist. He defends his cruelty, explaining that a warning would have tainted her neurological reaction. Her terror had to be raw, because only genuine panic forces a guilty psychopath to make a tactical error. Emma glares at him, profound betrayal burning in her dilated pupils. She asks if a tactical error means hiring an assassin to run her down on a highway. Nicholas tightens his jaw. For a fleeting micro-expression, his megalomaniac pride crumbles, and he admits his failure. He underestimated the violent desperation of a cornered thief. In that psychiatric moment, the dynamic shifts. Emma no longer sees an invincible kingpin, but an isolated, exhausted man fighting a war in the dark. This reveals a grim behavioral reality. Even the most calculating men will blindly gamble with innocent human collateral when pushed to the absolute psychological edge. The clinical truth hits her with terrifying clarity. She was the involuntary catalyst that detonated a criminal conspiracy. Emma draws a slow breath, using grounding techniques to pull her shattered nervous system back together. She locks her dilated eyes onto his, asking the ultimate question. What is the final operational move? Nicholas watches her, his psychopathic gaze like a frozen lake, holding devastating behavioral currents below. He speaks in a lethal whisper, vowing to dismantle the traitor entirely. His primary compulsion now is ensuring she survives until dawn. Emma remains silent, but a hard, unbreakable cognitive resolve settles over her features. You and I are witnessing a textbook psychological transformation here. You rarely invite the brutal chaos that crashes into your life, but your mind alone decides how you adapt and face the incoming storm. The silence stretches as Nicholas outlines the sociopathic mechanics of his strategy. Dragging her reputation through the mud was never intended as punishment. Her report was simply the final psychological nail he required. If he had validated her brilliant mind, the phantom would have vanished. Emma sits entirely frozen, her traumatized stare cutting through him like surgical glass. Nicholas holds his ground, his vocal cadence an unbroken rhythm. He explains that the enemy needed to process her as publicly broken to lower their guard. Emma closes her eyes, exhaling a trembling breath. She whispers the unforgivable behavioral truth. He reduced her to breathing human bait. It is a bitter clinical pill to swallow. In the ruthless theater of power, a narcissist will always prioritize absolute victory over a single bruised mind. The narcissist nods, validating his monstrous psychological scheme. He confesses she was used as live bait, but insists she was never unprotected. He deployed his surveillance ghosts, keeping his enforcer anchored in her shadow. He tells her she was never in genuine peril. Clinically, this is the worst thing he could have articulated. Emma fractures entirely. The suppressed terror violently erupts from her limbic system. She screams she was inches from becoming roadkill, beneath a speeding black sedan. If his enforcer had hesitated for a single microsecond, she would be a bloody memory on the pavement, and he dares to classify that as safe. Nicholas absorbs the verbal beating in uncharacteristic silence, his eyes heavy with an unfamiliar guilt. It proves a haunting psychological truth. A megalomaniac can construct the perfect behavioral cage, but he can never truly control the unpredictable chaos of the outside world. Let you and I open this clinical file together and observe the pathology in the room. Nicholas stands by the glass, presenting the classic physical collapse of a megalomaniac narcissist whose grand gamble has failed. He claims to be haunted by the image of Emma bleeding on the pavement, but we must ask if he mourns her, or merely his loss of control. Emma reacts with a primal, unpolished rage, demanding to know how her supposed protector could willingly feed her to the wolves. Nicholas counters with textbook manipulation, insisting she was not a pawn, but a brilliant spark meant to blind a traitor. He reframes his abuse as a compliment. Keep this simple life lesson in mind. When you treat loyal individuals as disposable pieces in your psychological games, you can never be shocked, when they finally decide to shatter the entire board. A hollow laugh escapes Emma, a physiological response to severe cognitive dissonance. She locks onto his gaze, attempting to strip away his narcissistic defense mechanisms. She whispers that he did not merely gamble with her survival, but with the profound trust she offered him. The untouchable criminal is momentarily paralyzed, lacking a script for genuine accountability. Emma retreats, finally articulating her core delusion. She believed that beneath his antisocial exterior, he valued her dedication. She thought her obsessive compliance would earn her a seat at his table, a classic early symptom of trauma bonding. Instead, she was just a disposable tool in his machinery. Consider this simple life lesson. The most devastating psychological wounds never come from our stated enemies, but from the mentors we foolishly dared to trust. The ambient heat of the room contrasts sharply with the clinical emotional freeze between our subjects. Emma refuses to repress her trauma, confronting the reality that he deliberately made her a target. Interestingly, the megalomaniac does not argue. He stares at the floor, his posture betraying a man suffocating in his own pathological violence. He instinctively tries to regain control by vowing to fix the situation with action, but Emma rejects his manipulation, demanding he sit with the sheer panic of almost causing her demise. She is fighting the pull of dependency by anchoring herself to the cold facts. Remember this simple life lesson. When a person removes their mask and shows you their capacity for cruelty, believe them immediately, and do not let their empty apologies rewrite the harsh truth. She turns away from the fire and exits, the heavy door shutting with an absolute finality. Notice how Nicholas designed this bedroom specifically to pacify her. Its utter perfection is a suffocating behavioral restraint. We observe precise cream sheets, low amber lighting, and the calming scent of lavender. Clinically speaking, it is a beautifully crafted psychological trap meant to foster dependency. Emma will not sleep. She pulls a blanket tightly around her shoulders, curling into a defensive posture by the window. As she stares into the pitch-black garden, her neural pathways are flooded with the bitter reality of his manipulation. This brings us to a very simple life lesson. A golden cage is still a cage, and no amount of forced luxury can ever sedate the agonizing realization that you have been played for a fool. Let us pause the analysis to examine the acute psychological whiplash this subject is enduring. Barely 2 days ago, Emma was exhibiting hypervigilance, desperate to prove her worth to a narcissist. Instead, she was used as live bait to flush out a traitor. The most insidious element of this control dynamic is that Nicholas always had operatives watching her from the shadows, maintaining total dominance. Now, her prefrontal cortex is completely overwhelmed. Should she flee, returning to the systemic trauma of extreme poverty? The looming crisis of her mother's medical debts acts as a powerful anchor, keeping her tethered to her abuser. Here is a simple life lesson for those agonizing moments. Sometimes the hardest choices have nothing to do with justice or pride. When survival is on the line, your ego must simply step aside. We must consider the baseline environment she escaped. A decaying apartment and nights spent paralyzed by the chronic stress of poverty. Nicholas is a pathological threat, yet he represents a critical resource for her survival. Remaining in his ecosystem requires navigating a daily labyrinth of deception and violence. However, Emma operates on strict logic. She trusts mathematical structures because they lack the capacity for human betrayal. Sitting in the dark, a profound cognitive shift occurs. She realizes she possesses the unique intellectual capacity to decode the financial web that even the megalomaniac could not comprehend. She has neutralized a predator. Remember this simple life lesson. Your deepest vulnerability in one environment might be your ultimate weapon in another. Being the smartest person in the room is the best defense mechanism you have. This dynamic unfolds like a classic study in trauma bonding. Merely by surviving, she forced this narcissistic monarch to momentarily drop his behavioral shield. She analyzed his pathology, proving he is not entirely devoid of human attachment. She correctly diagnoses that this terrifying individual is profoundly isolated. The rain beating against the glass mirrors her internal dysregulation. She replays the fractured expression in his eyes when she vocalized her trauma. Uncharacteristically, he deployed no defensive mechanisms, no arrogant deflections. He absorbed her fury, allowing genuine guilt to penetrate his grandiosity. He recognized his own deviance. Take this simple life lesson to heart. True accountability is never about constructing a fortress of rationalizations. It is about owning your failures and absorbing the full impact of the damage you caused. You and I are now watching a critical psychological pivot. The question is whether a shattered trust can ever be reconstructed. Emma approaches the glowing screen of her device, her nervous system finally settling. With steadying hands, she accesses the encrypted backups she had the foresight to preserve. We are observing a masterclass in adaptive survival. If she flees, she remains a victim. But if she remains in this highly toxic environment, she must restructure the power dynamic. She will no longer function as the narcissist's oblivious pawn. She is transitioning into the architect of the game. As the monitor illuminates her face, her tears are replaced by the cold affect of a strategist. Here is a simple, meaningful life lesson. When you discover the system was rigged against you, do not surrender. Analyze the board and learn to manipulate the variables yourself. As morning arrives, the atmospheric pressure lifts, casting a clinical bruised light across the bedroom. Emma sits up. The acute panic in her chest has successfully metabolized into calculated resilience. She forged her psychological armor in isolation. She is stationed at the edge of the bed when the door opens. Nicholas enters, but the grandiose predator profile is completely suppressed. He approaches with a cup of coffee, his micro-expressions displaying a fragile, almost desperate bid for connection. The overt hostility of their trauma bond has entered a dormant phase. Listen closely, because this is a simple life lesson we all need to understand. A new day does not chemically erase the damage of the past. It simply provides a structural opportunity to renegotiate a broken dynamic, provided you possess the cognitive strength to step out of the bitter ashes. His appearance is disheveled, lacking his usual immaculate presentation. For a brief, observable moment, the sociopathic mask completely dissolves. He presents as a vulnerable individual, visibly sinking under the cognitive weight of his own remorse. He places the mug on the table, takes a seat, and embraces the silence, transferring the locus of control directly to her. Emma monitors him, her defense mechanisms active, though the acute hostility from hours prior has regulated into a dull ache. Nicholas inhales unsteadily, his vocal tone dropping into a disarming softness. He confesses his night was consumed by the realization that she nearly perished due to his pathology. Here is a simple life lesson. True vulnerability is a remarkable strength. When you fracture a person's reality, dismantling your own ego is the only empirical path toward any real redemption. The verbalization fails him. He maintains eye contact, and the unfiltered distress in his pupils triggers a sympathetic, nervous response in Emma. This apex predator lacks the behavioral programming to beg for absolution, yet his silent posturing is a textbook submission signal. She utilizes the heat of the mug as a grounding technique before posing the variable that haunts her. Did his narcissistic brain ever register that she had zero desire to exist in his violent ecosystem? Nicholas absorbs the psychological strike. He softly admits his lack of entitlement to her empathy. However, he notes that the second she deciphered his financial data, she weaponized herself. Let this be a simple life lesson. Ignorance acts as an evolutionary shield. Once your perception grasps a dark reality, it irrevocably drags you into a conflict you never chose to fight. Emma exhibits a freeze response as the pattern crystallizes. His psychological armor is compromised. The clinical data aligns perfectly. This operation was never about misallocated funds. He is tracking an internal parasite. Nicholas visibly deflates, the chronic fatigue of paranoia overtaking him as he delivers the fatal variable. The operative dismantling his syndicate is Marcus Lane, his primary attachment figure for 20 years. A profound interpersonal rupture. Emma trembles as she processes being utilized as a disposable decoy. Nicholas insists the public riction was a calculated maneuver to convince the threat that she was entirely unprotected. You and I must hold on to this simple life lesson. Maintain your psychological boundaries. The most lethal trauma rarely originates from an adversary. It is almost always inflicted by the individual you trusted unconditionally. Let us open this case file together. The room grows suffocating as Nick confesses his obsessive surveillance. He admits he never left Emma unmonitored, deploying 3 armed operatives to track her every movement. Emma searches his micro-expressions for deceit, finding only profound guilt. The adrenaline leaves her system entirely. She exhales, asking what comes next. Nick encroaches on her physical space, sitting on the mattress edge. States he desperately requires her cognitive abilities to survive the impending conflict. The psychological lesson here is stark. Genuine protection is rarely a comforting emotional embrace. Most of the time, it is a cold, calculated operation executed in the shadows, neutralizing unseen threats so the subject can finally achieve true neurological rest. We observe Nick displaying a rare breach in his psychological armor. He confesses his lifelong condition gave him paranoia, yet Emma disrupts this cognitive baseline. For a criminal apex predator, such vulnerability is a staggering clinical anomaly. He respects her refusal to exhibit a typical fear response. She confronts him directly, demanding transparency. In return, Emma displays a classic trauma bonding reaction, a soft smile breaking across her fatigued features. She remarks on how he pushes her to the brink of collapse, only to anchor her again. Nick shows a visible physiological drop in tension. Realizing she will not flee, the clinical takeaway is simple. True courage acts as an absolute psychological magnet. Earning the respect of dangerous individuals requires you to stand your ground and never blink first. A genuine laugh escapes Emma, devoid of her standard defensive bitterness. She asks if his gentleness is a compensatory mechanism for the psychological trauma he caused. Nick bypasses his usual defenses, offering a slow, affirmative nod. In this isolated environment, their mutual trauma begins a complex process of symbiotic attachment. The observation shifts to Emma alone in a subterranean operations center, illuminated by harsh monitor glare. Her previous ambivalence is completely eradicated, replaced by a hyper-focused drive for the impending conflict. You and I have likely analyzed this behavioral pivot before. The most effective method for processing acute psychological devastation is to weaponize that chaotic pain. Channeling raw agony into a singular, obsessive purpose is how a subject asserts total dominance. This is the precise moment her behavioral profile transitions from passive victim to active aggressor. Emma ceases her role as a helpless variable. Utilizing encrypted data extracted from the server, she adopts the pathology of an apex predator. She dissects the financial data, exposing deeply entrenched systemic corruption. We observe illicit reserves disguised as lawful assets and phantom ledgers connecting to offshore entities. It is a highly sophisticated deception. However, Emma identifies an underlying algorithmic anomaly. Capital is hemorrhaging from a Miami locus, channeling directly into a Luxembourg vault. Consider this a vital psychological axiom. Never underestimate an individual who has been stripped of all external security. They will always detect the microscopic deviations that comfortable minds completely overlook. The primary identifier is erased, yet the human element always generates microscopic behavioral leakage. Emma isolates a concealed numerical sequence on her monitor. It perfectly matches the logistical code Marcus Lane utilizes for corporate transit. This is a catastrophic cognitive failure on his part. Her physiological arousal spikes as she cross-references his transit logs with the offshore anomalies. Each time Marcus traveled to a non-extradition jurisdiction, the Phantom Ledger registered massive capital extraction. Synthesized, these data points document millions systemically evaporating. Emma recedes from the monitor as the betrayal registers on a neurological level. This was an internal parasitic infection. the clinical reality is absolute. Pathological greed invariably produces a forensic trail, pointing directly back to the parasite. Marcus orchestrated a highly sophisticated embezzlement framework. An apparatus of this pathological perfection relies entirely on unverified trust. Emma initiates a manual mapping protocol, color-coding chronological data against offshore transfers. With each aggressive stroke of her pen, the psychological magnitude of the deception solidifies. Marcus is financing an autonomous shadow syndicate directly beneath Nick's field of perception. Within their sociopathic hierarchy, siphoning the primary resource pool is a fatal transgression. Emma reviews the complex network she just diagnosed. We observe a flood of dopamine manifesting as a triumphant, predatory expression. She has entirely compromised the apex lieutenant. The psychological lesson is clear. The more grandiose the narcissistic ego, driving the deception, the more devastating the collapse when reality finally strikes. Exhibiting absolute executive function, she compiles the forensic data into a single folder. Her transit down the marble corridor registers as a methodical psychological escalation. We observe Nick in his sanctuary. He presents as severely depleted, exhibiting chronic fatigue from continuous stress. Yet, the Mzblunken Emma breaches his perimeter. His physiology reacts. The dormant predatory instinct reactivates. She utilizes weaponized silence, depositing the dossier onto his workstation. Nick opens it. The ensuing quiet is pressurized, his eyes rapidly processing the data, while his facial effect flattens into an absolute mask. When he makes eye contact, his expression is a volatile mixture of pride and profound dread. This illustrates a core therapeutic truth. Delivering unfiltered reality is an immense psychological burden when complex trauma bonds are deeply rooted. Emma maintains direct eye contact, controlling her vocal modulation as she delivers the diagnosis. She identifies the internal parasite as Marcus. Nick enters a state of acute catatonic shock. The environmental stimuli seem to suspend. Eventually, a microscopic nod shatters his paralysis. He clinically validates her performance, but instructs her to detach so he can manage the violent eradication. Nick exhibits fine motor tremors as his fingers trace the graphical data. He displays the psychosomatic symptoms of a victim surviving an unexpected wound from a primary attachment figure. The quiet is oppressive, punctuated only by the aggressive friction of turning paper. Emma remains physically anchored, anticipating a catastrophic rupture. This is a bitter clinical reality. Exposing deep betrayal demands massive cognitive resources, and severing a fractured attachment is never a clean procedure. You and I must recognize this recurring behavioral loop. Emma adopts a defensive posture, anticipating explosive auditory aggression. Instead, Nick exhibits a deeply disturbing, psychopathic calm. Without warning, his suppressed rage breaches containment. He slams the dossier shut with extreme kinetic force. The regulated executive persona entirely disintegrates. Maintaining a predatory stare, he lowers his vocal pitch to a threatening whisper, demanding absolute verification. Emma stabilizes her physical stance. She states the data points were authenticated through triple redundancy. The anomalies mathematically align with the phantom transit records. The margin for error is absolute zero. Marcus siphoned resources for 8 months, manifesting textbook, God-complex delusions. Individuals suffering from terminal megalomania inevitably orchestrate their own destruction through sheer arrogance. We now witness the architectural manifestation of Nick's deep paranoia. Gripping the evidence, he engages a mechanical trigger within his bookshelf. A reinforced steel barrier retracts, revealing a subterranean descent. He issues a direct command for Emma to follow. She exhibits a micro-hesitation before complying. This space is a hyper-modern surveillance hub, saturated with live telemetry. Nick bypasses social protocol, approaching a combat-hardened operative named Paul, forcefully depositing the dossier. Nick's vocal tone has flatlined, void of any human affective resonance. He allocates 30 minutes for a secondary audit to validate Emma's hypothesis. It is a brutal psychiatric truth. Unconditional trust is a luxury for standard social structures. In a high lethality environment, empirical verification is the sole mechanism preserving biological life. Stick with me here. Nick is already initiating an aggressive counteroffensive. He demands Marcus's exact geographical coordinates within 10 minutes. Paul omits all conversational filler, initiating a rapid digital pursuit. Nick slowly pivots toward Emma. We observe a dark respect registering in his fatigued expression. He states he believed he acquired a docile analyst, not an apex predator capable of dismantling an empire's secrets. He issues a clear threat assessment. Emma suppresses her blink reflex entirely. She asserts her autonomy, declaring her traumatic assimilation was a conscious adaptation, and she now dictates her own parameters. Right then, Paul confirms the data. The geolocation isolates Marcus at the West Side facility. The final psychiatric assessment? Suppressed history never remains dormant. It always ruptures the surface and violently destabilizes your present reality. Let us open the clinical file and unpack this pathology together. The subject, Nick, exhibits the total detachment of a megalomaniac narcissist. Upon confirming the betrayal, his emotional baseline remains flat. He verbally deploys his strike unit, mad that the target, Marcus, be dragged to an isolation sector without a trace. As the room fractures into chaos, the secondary subject, Emma, feels the crushing gravity of this underworld. Instead of fleeing, we observe the terrifying roots of Stockholm Syndrome taking hold. Nick offers her an exit to avoid the trauma. She coldly refuses. The psychological lesson we extract from this is remarkably simple. Willfully closing your eyes to a violent reality never keeps you safe. It only leaves you defenseless when the shadows finally come to collect. Note the physical posturing in our primary subject. Nick closes the spatial gap, locking visual focus with Emma to reinforce her trauma bond. For the megalomaniac narcissist, Marcus did not simply steal currency. He committed the ultimate psychological sin by endangering the narcissist's prized possession, triggering a demand for absolute destruction. His verbal tone drops to a terminal frequency. Hours later, freezing fog blankets the estate, perfectly mirroring the clinical isolation of the subject's mind. He stands alone, stripping away his own empathy, to prepare for the execution of his oldest associate. We can observe a bitter reality in this behavioral pattern. Loyalty is an incredibly fragile construct, but perceived betrayal is a massive debt that a damaged mind will always force you to pay in full. The secondary subject exhibits severe hyperarousal, a classic stress response. Emma grips her mug tightly, her knuckles white as she stares into the morning fog. When Nick enters the room, presenting as the immaculate architect of a murder, she immediately recognizes his behavioral cues. He outlines the operational trap. The target is approaching under the false assumption of a business negotiation. Emma slowly lowers her drink. Despite her racing nervous system, she demands to remain in the environment. The narcissist attempts to assert control by denying her visual access to the violence. She repels his command, citing her own victimization as justification. The pathological lesson is deeply ingrained here. If you attempt to psychologically bury an individual, you must be absolutely certain, lack the resilience to claw their way back up to the surface. Let us look closely at Emma's defiant posture. She elevates her chin, actively seeking exposure to the traumatic event. Nick observes her under the overhead lighting, his facial micro-expressions revealing a rare cognitive dissonance. He approaches, casting a physical shadow over her form. His internal anxiety is evident. Will she view him as a protector, or accurately categorize him as a predator? He verbally warns her that the psychological entity waiting in the basement lacks a human soul. He defines himself as a rabid, compartmentalized beast. Yet, Emma maintains steady eye contact, recognizing the pathological burden he carries to ensure her survival. There is a fundamental truth we must extract from this dynamic. Occasionally in the human experience, there are consuming fires you must intentionally walk through if you ever expect to emerge, purified in the ashes. Emma sustains his frozen gaze, modulating her vocals to project absolute stability. She informs him her psychological framework is highly durable. Nick processes this input with a slow nod, countering with a clinical reality. Possessing the capacity to endure trauma does not obligate one to invite it. He compartmentalizes the impending violence, claiming exclusive ownership of the execution. Outside, the auditory stimulus of tires crushing gravel shatters the quiet. A vehicle door impacts its frame. Nick monitors the time, his facial muscles locking into the rigid affect of a habitual killer. He issues a final directive for her to remain stationary. The clinical takeaway here is absolute. The only effective method for rectifying a catastrophic failure is to force yourself to stare directly into the resulting trauma, regardless of the psychological cost. Observe the micro-hesitation before the subject initiates his exit. Nick breaches her spatial boundary, applying gentle tactile pressure to her face. His thumb traces her cheek, a grounding mechanism utilized by individuals anticipating a descent into dissociative violence. He vocalizes a rigid absolute, guaranteeing her physical security. Emma experiences involuntary muscle spasms from extreme stress, yet maintains visual lock. She issues a counter-directive. She instructs him not to terminate the target for her benefit, but because the target is a systemic toxin. The behavioral lesson here is critical. Never allow the blinding intoxication of vengeance to dictate your actions, or the resulting cognitive dissonance will consume you entirely. Nick's jaw tightens. He accepts her framing, rationalizing the murder as a simple penalty, and exits into the silence. Let us examine the post-incident data together, because the aftermath is where the true psychological fragmentation occurs. The heavy oak door opens without auditory warning, but the sluggish friction of his footwear indicates massive depletion. Emma's physiological baseline plummets the moment Nick re-enters the visual field. He has changed his garments, yet his sleeves adhere to damp wrists, indicating a frantic sterilization protocol. He displays no biological material from the victim, but his ocular presentation is deeply vacant. He has fully dissociated. Emma wisely suppresses any verbal response. Providing a fractured individual with a vacuum of silence is often the most strategic intervention you can offer, while they process acute trauma. She observes the megalomaniac collapse into his chair, respiration severely depressed, before he ejects two hollow words. It is done. He delivers those syllables devoid of emotional resonance, yet the psychological impact on Emma is profound. She suppresses the urge to interrogate the forensic details of the termination or the physical condition of the victim. Instead, she analyzes his vacant presentation and internalizes the permanent shift in her reality. The target has been permanently deleted. This criminal ecosystem operates without pardons. The cognitive integration of this fact forces her to accept her complicity. The most destructive behavioral choices forge an inescapable psychological tether, and the human mind is forced to drag that anchor indefinitely. Nick's posture degrades. He applies pressure to his cranial regions, engaging in severe mental gymnastics to rationalize the execution of a primary attachment figure. The room radiates with the unseen weight of his psychological collapse. The friction of her chair, breaking the silence, signals her behavioral shift. She navigates the room to position herself at his flank, refusing to trigger his defensive mechanisms with rapid inquiries or attempts to extract him from his dissociative loop. Instead, she applies direct tactile stimulation to his shoulder, acting as a grounding object within his cognitive chaos. Maintaining a regulated nervous system, while another individual experiences total psychological fragmentation, is the ultimate demonstration of relational durability. Slowly, the subject elevates his visual field, and the impenetrable facade of the megalomaniac disintegrates. What remains is a severely damaged human. He secures her hand, pulling her into his proximity. He censors the violent data, but the somatic tremors vibrating through his skeletal structure betray the truth. This was a profound attachment rupture. The environmental silence becomes oppressive, saturated with unprocessed trauma. Eventually, his psychological containment fails. His auditory output is severely degraded, indicative of massive exhaustion. He verbalizes extreme hostility over his failure to isolate her, expressing cognitive dissonance over his monstrous actions. Emma demonstrates zero startle response. She places her hand directly over his accelerated cardiac rhythm to establish a somatic link. She verbally restructures his reality, reinforcing her Stockholm syndrome by defining his sociopathic behavior as a simple fulfillment of a protective contract, descending into the psychological dirt to remind a fractured individual of their value is a complex lesson in human attachment. Nick fixates on her like an organism detecting oxygen. He collapses forward, grounding his forehead against hers, releasing a deeply ragged exhalation. Let us close this file with one final observation. She does not physically reject the toxic variables of his pathology. Instead, she increases manual pressure on his digits. Through that microscopic biological feedback, Nick registers a profound psychological validation. Emma demands no ethical rationalizations for the murder. Her cognitive focus is entirely isolated on the fact that her protector fulfilled his verbal contract. Locating an individual who can clinically observe your most malignant psychological defects without attempting an intervention is a deeply haunting lesson in human survival. They maintain this static posture as the diurnal cycle concludes. The fading daylight projects elongated shapes across the flooring, reflect on their severe mental depletion. Nick refuses to release his grip. He is not securing a captive object. He is anchoring himself to the only tether, preventing his total psychological erasure. You and I are going to examine the suffocating quiet of this room together. Observe the posture. Emma slowly tilts her weight, pressing her cheek against the tense slope of his shoulder. Clinically speaking, this shift telegraphs profound traumatic bonding. She is completely absorbed into the orbit of a violent predator, all psychological exits destroyed. Breaking the silence, she asks a probing question. Does the cognitive load of acting as an executioner ever exhaust him? There is a universal truth we must all acknowledge. The relentless machinery of a destructive existence will inevitably consume the mind from the inside out. Nick stares blankly at the plaster. Dropping the calculated facade of the untouchable kingpin, he exhales a single, shattered yes. Nick turns his head, his tone flattening as he articulates his bleak reality. He explains the extreme hypervigilance required of a kingpin. A single display of weakness invites lethal retaliation. Psychological fatigue is simply not an option. Staring at the scar tissue on his hands, he rationalizes his behavior, claiming the violence was environmental necessity rather than choice. This highlights a profound lesson for anyone facing extreme adversity. Fully accepting the grim reality of your circumstances is often the only defense against total collapse. Emma sits in mute observation. A deeply toxic reverence for her captor floods her nervous system. In an underworld defined by shallow graves, she processes his terrifying transparency as the ultimate manifestation of profound trust. You and I must examine Blad's shirt, this clinical contradiction together, and say, we observe a subject who orchestrates a vast criminal enterprise with zero empathetic restraint, yet paradoxically shields this woman from his carnage. Emma asks if he has ever trusted the inherent goodness of another person. The inquiry is a severe psychological trigger. A mechanized smile distorts his facial muscles as he recounts a surrogate brother who fled before the underworld could corrupt him. The lesson here is essential. Complete withdrawal is frequently the only way to preserve your sanity when dealing with absolute toxicity. Emma processes this data instantly. That deep historical abandonment is the exact trauma that forced him to construct his impenetrable, emotional fortress. The psychological barriers are now dismantled. Emma describes the cognitive dissonance of her past when she viewed humanity in neat moral binaries. Observing his predatory survival tactics has eradicated that innocence. She rationalizes his antisocial behavior, accepting that moral transgression is sometimes necessary for self-preservation. Nick remains rigid, paralyzed by a profound autonomic response. She does not validate his sadism, but she has normalized his violence, extinguishing her fear entirely. His narcissistic armor finally fractures. He touches her with lethal hands, stating he never sought absolution. Here is a critical life lesson. Genuine connection never requires endorsing a person's darkest flaws. It simply means holding your ground when their reality goes completely black. The clinical silence breaks. Nick's vocal tremors reveals a subject entirely stripped of his defensive psychopathy. He focuses on Emma, the anomaly who bypassed his paranoia, verbalizing a desperate need for her to stay. Her response carries immense psychological weight. She refuses to flee, but demands an end to his compartmentalized secrecy. No more hidden variables or concealed lethality. Her steady baseline illustrates a critical lesson. Any sustainable partnership requires establishing firm, non-negotiable boundaries. Nick gives a submissive nod. He initiates physical contact, kissing her forehead in a rare display of genuine affection. The apex predator suddenly transforms into a secure attachment figure. She lowers her cognitive defenses, finally integrating into his pathological reality. Emma enters the study, her body language displaying the calculated grace of a fully integrated co-conspirator. Nick occupies the shadows, experiencing a depressive drop, while his subordinates sanitize the crime scene outside. He quietly asks if she slept. Her response is a forceful auditory stimulus, slamming a massive dossier onto his desk. She establishes unblinking eye contact with a diagnosed sociopath, demanding systemic control over his illicit infrastructure. You and I can extract a crucial lesson from this shift. Refusing to occupy a passive role in your narrative is the only method to rewrite a predetermined destiny. Nick reorients his physical frame toward her. He exhibits zero hostility. Instead, he is clinically mesmerized by her voluntary, fearless immersion into his violent reality. We must clinically analyze this severe behavioral pivot. Emma maintains sustained eye contact with an apex predator, systematically dismantling her victim persona. She demands total operational transparency, requiring access to the violent data sustaining his pathology. Nick's motor functions freeze. He breaches her personal space, scanning her micro-expressions for autonomic fear, seeking a reason to isolate her for protection. She offers zero physiological reaction, maintaining a flattened, psychopathic calm. The psychological lesson here is vital. Confronting your deepest traumas often requires completely burning your own safety nets. She is rapidly establishing cognitive dominance, effectively mirroring his disorder to achieve absolute parity in their shared psychosis. We observe a rare phenomenon for a megalomaniac. This subject, conditioned by decades of hypervigilance, experiences a spontaneous collapse of his ego defenses. A heavy exhalation signals a drop in his chronic paranoia. He accesses a safe and retrieves a titanium enclosure. This object represents the externalized core of his pathology, holding the digital architecture of his corruption and lethal collateral. He issues a warning, his tone indicating genuine shame. The lesson here redefines connection. Clinical trust is never about projecting an idealized self. It is the act of handing a loaded weapon to another person, pointing the barrel at your own sternum, and trusting them not to fire. It is an absolute, fatal surrender. He has just relinquished his entire survival mechanism. The tangible weight of his pathology sits between them. Nick lowers his voice, offering a final psychological off-ramp, a last chance to detach with her sanity intact. Emma exhibits an alarming lack of autonomic response. Her motor skills remain perfectly steady as she accepts the titanium, voluntarily absorbing the traumatic inheritance of his violent history. She issues a quiet confirmation. A micro-expression of profound relief alters Nick's facial structure. He views her not as a narcissistic supply, but as his singular anchoring mechanism. The behavioral lesson here is undeniable. When a subject discovers the catalyst that stabilizes their internal chaos, they will latch on with terrifying force. Their shared psychosis is now absolute, locking them into a mutually destructive trajectory. The exact moment she touches the metal, Her previous identity experiences total psychological death. She is fully submerged in his antisocial reality. Hours later, we observe her isolated in the office, surrounded by intelligence. The titanium enclosure acts as a severe stressor, holding the lethal secrets of the syndicate. Astonishingly, she presents zero physical tremors. Her respiratory rate is regulated like a metronome. This provides a vital lesson regarding human dominance. True psychological power is rarely performative. It is the ability to maintain a chilling, flattened effect when external pressure dictates an emotional collapse. She handles a security credential, fully cognizant of the combat zone she has entered, and her neural pathways simply adapt to the ruin. Picture this clinical scenario with me. The latch clicks, signaling Nick's entry. He projects the suffocating gravity of a dominant personality, yet his habitual predatory menace is entirely absent, replaced by severe behavioral hesitation. He approaches the desk exhibiting the body language of a subordinate, his narcissistic armor completely deactivated. His voice is a harsh scrape as he asks if she processed the files. Emma rotates her chair, her facial muscles locked in absolute autonomic peace. This exchange validates a profound psychological reality. The most dangerous individuals possess the cognitive flexibility to completely expose their vulnerabilities when necessary. Surviving this environment requires precise situational awareness, and Nick executes this submission with chilling grace. Today, you and I are going to unpack this pathology together. Emma maintains unbroken eye contact, shifting their clinical dynamic permanently. Her vocal baseline is flat as she rejects his pedestal, volunteering to manage the ledgers and execute violence alongside him. We observe the classic response of the megalomaniac narcissist. Nick exhibits temporary paralysis, scanning her face to validate his pathology. He invades her space to present a lethal reality. If his empire burns, she incinerates with it. The clinical truth we must accept is that a trauma bond requires mutual destruction. You cannot demand the crown while avoiding the blood. Fully manifesting her Stockholm syndrome, Emma shows zero autonomic stress, coldly vowing to bury their enemies. Once her verbal commitment registers, the room functions as an isolation chamber for two pathological subjects. Nick elevates his hand, his scarred knuckles grazing her jaw, with a reverence that contradicts his violent baseline. Emma leans into the heat of his palm, closing the physical gap. This is not romance. It is a fatal, symbiotic collision. They are finalizing a clinical blood pact, stepping outside all moral boundaries. If you desire total dominion, you must be willing to ignite the fuel and destroy your own escape routes. Crossing this behavioral point of no return is the only reliable method to confront the underlying psychopathy within your own cortex. The innocent civilian she was yesterday is permanently deceased, and the cognitive restructuring is now absolute. Upon physical separation, the silence carries heavy psychological contracts. Emma rests her forehead against his, a humanizing smile instantly fracturing the sociopathic mask he maintains for the syndicate. She verbally anchors her identity to his location. Nick grips her fingers like a critical survival mechanism. Outside, predators anticipate a failure in his hierarchy. Internally, the paradigm has shifted. She is no longer a civilian requiring protection. She has become his operational general. The clinical reality is that a severe trauma bond fundamentally alters the geometry of survival. Even a megalomaniac narcissist achieves stabilization when he encounters a subject whose mental architecture perfectly mirrors his own structural damage. Let us analyze this behavioral shift together. The next morning, Emma enters the war room, fully assuming her identity as the organizational architect. The tension spikes, and the egos of hardened enforcers collapse into autonomic fear. Bypassing social posturing, she initiates a forensic audit of the ledgers. Her elevated cognitive processing rapidly isolates a massive financial anomaly. Beneath fabricated corporate entities, she identifies a hemorrhage of illicit funds. An internal parasite is siphoning capital directly from the kingpin. Here is a vital clinical lesson. Never underestimate the quiet, observant individual in a hostile environment. They are always calculating the hidden structural vulnerabilities long before the entire hierarchy experiences a catastrophic collapse. Observe the psychological density of this space. The room is contaminated with fragile egos. The old guard projects hostility as Emma systematically presents the incriminating financial data, displaying classic narcissistic control. Nick remains in the periphery, offering non-verbal validation of her dominance. When the technician verifies her accuracy, the collective shock is absolute. Her psychological dependency has weaponized into pure operational efficiency. She spends 14 days rebuilding their financial infrastructure, constructing an encryption matrix that leaves even the kingpin in silent fascination. Competence does not require aggressive vocalization. To achieve dominance in a hierarchy, present undeniable empirical excellence, and watch the obsolete components submit. Stick with me here, because we are seeing this symbiosis in action. A rival faction utilizes legal documentation as a predatory trap to destabilize Nick's operation. Emma processes the data without an elevated heart rate, displaying acute pattern recognition. She identifies the linguistic snare and executes a countermeasure, sliding a revised contract across the table. The scrape of the paper functions as a psychological gunshot, solidifying the megalomaniac narcissist's authority. Even hardened enforcers exhibit involuntary respect, delivering a validating physical gesture to her shoulder. The clinical reality is undeniably clear. Concrete, empirical actions will always carve a much more permanent behavioral legacy than empty vocalizations deployed during moments of high stress. Emma rapidly neutralizes a structural threat in their supply chain. We observe a crucial transition in their interpersonal dynamic that evening. In the subdued lighting, Emma physically anchors herself against Nick. As he initiates contact, the sociopathic hostility completely evaporates from his vocal patterns. He provides direct verbal validation of her exceptional cognitive output, demonstrating the euphoria of advanced Stockholm syndrome. She intertwines their fingers and promises escalating commitment. The clinical lesson here is significant. When an individual discovers a rhythm that maximizes their utility, they bypass all internal limitations. Nick issues a genuine laugh, finally realizing the unprecedented pathological asset he has successfully bonded to his environment. In this interaction, Nick lowers his vocal decibels, confessing he no longer needs empirical data to verify her utility. He successfully identified her psychological malleability. Two highly fractured psychopathologies are synthesizing perfectly. His organization achieves stability because her trauma bond provides an emotional core to a sterile sociopathic machine. By dawn, Nick maintains physical stillness, visually monitoring her respiratory rate. She represents a complete behavioral anomaly. We assume severe clinical cases operate in extreme isolation. However, maximal power is never achieved in a cognitive vacuum. It requires a secondary subject who enables the primary pathology and protects the perimeter when threats elevate. Nick employs defensive cognitive deflection, normalizing his tone. His jaw constricts involuntarily as he asks her to meet his maternal figure. He is not requesting the syndicate architect, but the stabilizing presence of her baseline persona. We observe a severe autonomic fear response, bleeding into his visual focus. A dominant megalomaniac narcissist is experiencing physiological tremors over a simple civilian transport event. He describes an isolated rural structure, completely sanitized of his violent outputs. His mother processes a fabricated reality of corporate employment. This demonstrates a vital psychological necessity. Even the most pathological minds require a sanitized geographical origin point to anchor their fractured identity and prevent total cognitive collapse. Emma processes the severe neurological fatigue in his presentation. The paradox of his pathology is clear. Beneath his sociopathic armor, he functions as a devoted offspring, willing to endure psychological damage to maintain an uncorrupted environment for his maternal figure. Emma provides an affirmative response. By the weekend, they navigate a desolate highway. The absence of syndicate security lowers their cortisol levels, providing a therapeutic effect. She shares data from her developmental years, while he recounts manual labor tasks. They approach an isolated structure surrounded by floral stimuli. The most profound shifts in our psychological architecture always occur during low-intensity, vulnerable exposure events that we completely fail to establish defensive parameters against. We transition to observe the maternal figure. Her emotional output provides high positive reinforcement. She initiates deep physical contact with Nick, a stark contrast to his usual environment, then extends this unearned psychological safety to Emma. During a shared meal, the mother details historical data where a juvenile Nick sustained physical trauma to protect a sibling. Emma registers authentic neurological pleasure until a severe atmospheric shift occurs. The mother's vocal frequency destabilizes as she recounts the termination of Nick's paternal figure, identifying this as the exact temporal coordinate where his emotional processing became necrotic. The clinical analysis is absolute, massive. Unprocessed trauma will invariably restructure the entire foundational framework of the human organism. You and I must evaluate the final manifestation of this cognitive distortion. Nick escorts his maternal figure indoors. Emma remains in the external environment, her tactile sensors interacting with the flora. The radical absence of threat stimuli creates a massive psychological juxtaposition against their violent baseline. Standing stationary, Emma experiences a catastrophic emotional realization. Her Stockholm Syndrome has reached terminal velocity. She is fundamentally trauma-bonded, not to the megalomaniac narcissist controlling the syndicate, but to the fractured biological unit who meticulously shields his mother. The most dangerous dependency occurs when a subject learns to embrace the unfiltered thought pathology of their captor, abandoning any desire to correct their tragic condition. Let us examine this clinical file together, you and I. Nick steps into the daylight, locating her among the flora. He closes the physical gap in absolute silence. His hand brushes hers, a microscopic movement. But in their violent environment, the psychological gravity is staggering. Emma rotates to face him. For the first time on record, her ironclad defensive mechanisms dissolve. We observe no strategic distancing, no calculated behavioral games. She does not force vocalizations. The heavy silence transmits all the data. Reality bleeds from the unprotected state of her pupils as their fingers interlock under the open sky. The lesson here is fundamental. True connection thrives in quiet spaces. Silence is often the most unbreakable vow a human mind can ever make. Night falls, painting the timber in cold silver moonlight. The subjects sit on a decaying bench. The chaotic auditory stimuli of the city are gone. No burner phones ringing, only the rhythm of insects. Nick maintains a catatonic silence. His eyes fixate on the black tree line, dragging a repressed trauma to the surface. Emma waits, observing the agonizing somatic pressure crushing his chest. When his vocal cords finally engage, his tone is ruined. He unseals the file on Daniel, his younger brother, a boy displaying extreme naivety, who genuinely believed the world contained benevolent figures. The psychological lesson is brutal but necessary. Innocence is a beautiful light. Yet in the hands of a predator, pure trust becomes the most dangerously fragile thing on earth. We must analyze this behavioral trigger together, you and I. When their father expired, their mother suffered a psychological collapse. That fracture forced Nick into a violent survival model. Daniel rejected this path. When the old syndicate engaged in illicit operations, Daniel acted on a hero complex and alerted the opposition. 3 days later, authorities extracted his corpse from a staged vehicular collision. A cartel message. Nick decoded the forensic reality too late. He could not retaliate without placing a terminal target on his mother, so he repressed his impulses. He buried his screaming rage in his subconscious and retreated. The clinical lesson is agonizing. Sometimes, adhering to a strict moral code will cost you absolutely everything you value in this life. The lens holds steady. After his sibling's termination, Nick developed emotional blunting, classifying attachment as a fatal vulnerability. Yet, observing Emma now, his reactivity spikes. His vocal register drops. He notes she lacks Daniel's naivety. She comprehends their vicious syndicate reality, yet exhibits extreme proximity-seeking behavior. He issues a binding verbal contract. He cannot provide baseline security, but he will accept termination before the underworld claims her. Emma maintains eye contact. She bypasses his sociopathic exterior and identifies the traumatized, grieving adolescent bleeding internally. The psychological lesson is absolute. Real loyalty means standing firmly beside a partner, even when their entire external environment burns to ash. The record fixates on Emma in the morning light. She finally processes the cognitive breakthrough. Genuine pair bonding is not some theatrical monologue. It is the repetitive behavioral loop of actively choosing to remain. Her fingers extend, mapping the scar tissue along his mandible. She requires only the empirical certainty that when her reality fragments, his grip will stabilize her. She registers an ironclad commitment to extract him from the void when the syndicate calls. Nick shifts his angle, sealing his eyelids as he presses a tactile response into her palm. It is a neurological point of no return. The core lesson is clear. Real strength is not existing in an unbroken state. It is securing an ally brave enough to extract you from the dirt when you inevitably collapse. Examine this behavioral cross-section. The clinical anomaly is Emma's total absence of the fear response. The male subject carries a history of extreme violence, mapped with trauma markers, yet he is the exact defensive mechanism she selects for the upcoming territorial disputes. The environment shifts to an isolated exterior zone. A timber surface rests under the low illumination of an open flame. The olfactory trace of lavender lingers. Nick cants a red liquid. His microbacid liquid, his microglassal is broadcasting a suppressed vulnerability his criminal adversaries have never processed. The behavioral lesson is vital. True victory is not constructing an empire of terror. It is identifying the rare entity that regulates your nervous system, while the external world spirals into absolute anarchy. You and I know how statistically rare these decompression cycles are. When a subject is exposed to chronic lethal threats, peace is misidentified as an ambush. But here, the momentum decelerates, allowing their taxed nervous systems to recover. They enter this bruised phase because they consciously bypass their isolation protocols. Nick elevates his glass, his defensive plating dismantled. He acknowledges her loyalty, even after exposing the most malignant fragments of his psyche. The acoustic strike of glass reverberates. Emma's facial muscles relax, calculating the gravity of the exchange. The lesson is simple. No human specimen operates without flaws. True strength only activates when you find the courage to maintain unblinking eye contact with your own internal demons. Beneath the flames, their antisocial personas disintegrate. They no longer present as ruthless operators. They regress to baseline entities engaging in communal nourishment. They exchange quiet narratives, permitting the silence to perform the psychological processing.
The era for histrionic syndicate oaths is
terminated. The only remaining variable is the empirical certainty that tomorrow they will maintain a united defensive front. This behavioral evolution demonstrates a profound clinical truth. Authentic connection is never generated by locating a perfectly intact specimen. It is engineered by observing another subject's fractured psychological architecture and committing to the stabilization process. Find an ally who remains steady during your decompensation phases, and you will survive. You and I must review their behavioral prognosis. They occupy the wreckage of their psychological structures, facing a severe rehabilitation. They are constructing a terrifying concept for traumatized subjects, a secure environment where hypervigilance can deactivate. The external world remains hostile, saturated with former adversaries. The critical shift here is the removal of the isolation variable. They will never engage these threats unilaterally again. What is your clinical assessment of this file? Have you experienced cognitive dissonance where emotion demands one outcome, but logic violently resists? Share your findings in the comments below. The ultimate survival tactic in this life is distributing our psychological weight, relying on a verified ally when the world goes dark.
The final lesson from Emma and Nick's journey is about healing after betrayal, fear, and emotional wounds. Nick has lived for years believing that trust is dangerous. After losing his brother Daniel, he learns to survive through control, suspicion, and secrecy. Emma, on the other hand, enters his world wounded by humiliation and nearly killed because of a conspiracy she did not understand. Both characters have reasons to close themselves off, yet the story shows that healing does not happen by avoiding pain forever. It happens when people choose trust carefully, honestly, and with open eyes. Emma does not forgive Nick instantly. She confronts him, names the harm, and demands change. That is important because forgiveness without accountability becomes weakness. Nick does not ask her to approve of everything he has done. Instead, he learns to return, listen, and share the truth. Their bond becomes meaningful because it is not based on perfection. It is based on acceptance, honesty, and the willingness to rebuild after damage. The trip to meet Nick's mothers adds emotional depth as Emma sees the softest truth behind his hardened exterior. She understands that he is not simply powerful. He is wounded, protective, and shaped by loss. This teaches viewers that people are more than their worst choices, but growth requires responsibility. Trust should not be blind. It should be earned through consistent actions. Emma chooses Nick not because his world is easy, but because he begins to let her walk beside him without lies. The broader educational lesson is hopeful. Even after betrayal, fear, and broken trust, people can build something stronger if they are brave enough to be honest. Healing is not forgetting the past. It is choosing a future growth is no longer hidden.